Section 8 of The Trembling of a Leaf. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lilith Brander. The Trembling of a Leaf by W. Somerset Maugham. Section 8. The Pool. Part 2. "You don't know how much I love you," he said. "I'd give anything in the world to be able to tell you what I've got in my heart." He sought her lips. The summer came. The highland valley was green and fragrant, and the hills were gay with the heather. One sunny day followed another in that sheltered spot, and the shade of the birch trees was grateful after the glare of the high road. Ethel spoke no more of Samoa, and Lawson grew less nervous. He thought that she was resigned to her surroundings, and he felt that his love for her was so passionate that it could leave no room in her heart for any longing. One day the local doctor stopped him in the street. "I say, Lawson, your missus ought to be careful how she bathes in our Highland streams. It's not like the Pacific, you know." Lawson was surprised, and had not the presence of mind to conceal the fact. "I didn't know she was bathing." The doctor laughed. "A good many people have seen her. It makes them talk a bit, you know, because it seems a rum place to choose to pull up above the bridge, and bathing isn't allowed there. But there's no harm in that. I don't know how she can stand the water." Lawson knew the pool the doctor spoke of, and suddenly it occurred to him that in a way it was just like that pool in Upolu where Ethel had been in the habit of bathing every evening. A clear highland stream ran down a sinuous course, rocky, splashing gaily, and then formed a deep, smooth pool, with a little sandy beach. Trees overshadowed it thickly, not coconut trees but beeches, and the sun played fitfully through the leaves on the sparkling water. It gave him a shock. With his imagination he saw Ethel go there every day and undress on the bank and slip into the water, cold, colder than that of the pool she loved at home, and for a moment regained the feeling of the past. He saw her once more as the strange wild spirit of the stream, and it seemed to him fantastically that the running water called her. That afternoon he went along to the river. He made his way cautiously among the trees, and the grassy path deadened the sound of his steps. Presently he came to a spot from which he could see the pool. Ethel was sitting on the bank, looking down at the water. She sat quite still. It seemed as though the water drew her irresistibly. He wondered what strange thoughts wandered through her head. At last she got up. For a minute or two she was hidden from his gaze. Then he saw her again, wearing a Mother Hubbard, and with her little bare feet she stepped delicately over the mossy bank. She came to the water's edge and softly, without a splash, let herself down. She swam about quietly, and there was something not quite of a human being in the way she swam. He did not know why it affected him so queerly. He waited till she clambered out. She stood for a moment with the wet folds of her dress clinging to her body so that its shape was outlined, and then, passing her hand slowly over her breasts, gave a little sigh of delight. Then she disappeared. Lawson turned away and walked back to the village. He had a bitter pain in his heart, for he knew that she was still a stranger to him, and his hungry love was destined ever to remain unsatisfied. He did not make any mention of what he had seen. He ignored the incident completely, but he looked at her curiously, trying to divine what was in her mind. He redoubled the tenderness with which he used her. He sought to make her forget the deep longing of her soul by the passion of his love. Then one day, when he came home, he was astonished to find her not in the house. "Where's Mrs. Lawson?" he asked the maid. "She went into Aberdeen, sir, with the baby." The maid answered, a little surprised at the question. "She said she would not be back till the last train." "Oh, all right." He was vexed that Ethel had said nothing to him about the excursion, but he was not disturbed, since of late she had been in now and again to Aberdeen, and he was glad that she should look at the shops and perhaps visit a cinema. He went to meet the last train, but when she did not come, he grew suddenly frightened. He went up to the bedroom and saw at once that her toilet things were no longer in their place. He opened the wardrobe and the drawers. They were half empty. She had bolted. He was seized with a passion of anger. It was too late that night to telephone to Aberdeen to make inquiries, but he knew already all that his inquiries might have taught him. With fiendish cunning she had chosen a time when they were making up their periodical accounts at the bank, and there was no chance that he could follow her. He was imprisoned by his work. He took up a paper and saw that there was a boat sailing for Australia next morning. She must be now well on the way to London. He could not prevent the sobs that were wrung painfully from him. "I've done everything in the world for her," he cried, "and she had the heart to treat me like this. How cruel, how monstrously cruel." After 2 days of misery he received a letter from her. It was written in her schoolgirl hand. She had always written with difficulty. "Dear Bertie, I couldn't stand it any more. I'm going back home. Goodbye. Ethel." She did not say a single word of regret. She did not even ask him to come too. Lawson was prostrated. He found out where the ship made its first stop, and though he knew very well she would not come, sent a cable beseeching her to return. He waited with pitiful anxiety. He wanted her to send him just one word of love. She did not even answer. He passed through one violent phase after another. At one moment he told himself that he was well rid of her, and at the next that he would force her to return by withholding money. He was lonely and wretched. He wanted his boy, and he wanted her. He knew that, whatever he pretended to himself, there was only one thing to do, and that was to follow her. He could never live without her now. All his plans for the future were like a house of cards, and he scattered them with angry impatience. He did not care whether he threw away his chances for the future, but nothing in the world mattered but that he should get Ethel back again. As soon as he could he went into Aberdeen and told the manager of his bank that he meant to leave at once. The manager remonstrated. The short notice was inconvenient. Lawson would not listen to reason. He was determined to be free before the next boat sailed, and it was not until he was on board of her, having sold everything he possessed, that in some measure he regained his calm. Till then, to those who had come in contact with him, he seemed hardly sane. His last action in England was to cable to Ethel at Apia that he was joining her. He sent another cable from Sydney, and when at last with the dawn his boat crossed the bar at Apia, and he saw once more the white houses straggling along the bay, he felt an immense relief. The doctor came on board and the agent. They were both old acquaintances, and he felt kindly towards their familiar faces. He had a drink or two with them for old times' sake, and also because he was desperately nervous. He was not sure if Ethel would be glad to see him. When he got into the launch and approached the wharf, he scanned anxiously the little crowd that waited. She was not there, and his heart sank. But then he saw Weir, and his old blue clothes, and his heart warmed towards him. "Where's Ethel?" he said, as he jumped on shore. "She's down at the bungalow. She's living with us." Lawson was dismayed, but he put on a jovial air. "Well, have you got room for me? I dare say it'll take a week or two to fix ourselves up." "Oh, yes, I guess we can make room for you." After passing through the custom house they went to the hotel, and there Lawson was greeted by several of his old friends. There were a good many rounds of drinks before it seemed possible to get away, and when they did go out at last to Weir's house they were both rather gay. He clasped Ethel in his arms. He had forgotten all his bitter thoughts in the joy of beholding her once more. His mother-in-law was pleased to see him, and so was the old wrinkled beldame, her mother. Natives and half-caste came in, and they all sat round, beaming on him. Brevald had a bottle of whisky, and every one who came was given a nip. Lawson sat with his little dark-skinned boy on his knees. They had taken his English clothes off him, and he was stark with Ethel by his side in the Mother Hubbard. He felt like a returning prodigal. In the afternoon he went down to the hotel again, and when he got back he was more than gay, he was drunk. Ethel and her mother knew that white men got drunk now and then. It was what you expected of them, and they laughed good-naturedly as they helped him to bed. But in a day or two he set about looking for a job. He knew that he could not hope for such a position as that which he had thrown away to go to England, but with his training he could not fail to be useful to one of the trading firms, and perhaps in the end he would not lose by the change. After all, you can't make money in a bank, he said. Trade's the thing. He had hopes that he would soon make himself so indispensable that he would get someone to take him into partnership, and there was no reason why in a few years he should not be a rich man. As soon as I'm fixed up, we'll find ourselves a shack, he told Ethel. We can't go on living here. Brevard's bungalow was so small that they were all piled on one another, and there was no chance of ever being alone. There was neither peace nor privacy. Well, there's no hurry. We shall be all right here till we find just what we want. It took him a week to get settled, and then he entered the firm of a man called Bain. But when he talked to Ethel about moving, she said she wanted to stay where she was till her baby was born, for she was expecting another child. Lawson tried to argue with her. If you don't like it, she said, go and live at the hotel. He grew suddenly pale. Ethel, how can you suggest that? She shrugged her shoulders. What's the good of having a house of our own when we can live here? He yielded. When Lawson, after his work, went back to the bungalow, he found it crowded with natives. They lay about smoking, sleeping, drinking kava, and they talked incessantly. The place was grubby and untidy. His child crawled about, playing with native children, and he had nothing spoken but Samoan. He fell into the habit of dropping into the hotel on his way home to have a few cocktails, but he could only face the evening and the crowd of friendly natives when he was fortified with liquor. And all the time, though he loved her more passionately than ever, he felt that Ethel was slipping away from him. When the baby was born, he suggested that they should get into a house of their own, but Ethel refused. Her stay in Scotland seemed to have thrown her back on her own people, now that she was once more among them, with a passionate zest, and she turned to her native ways with abandon. Lawson began to drink more. Every Saturday night he went to the English club and got blind drunk. He had the peculiarity that as he grew drunk, he grew quarrelsome, and once he had a violent dispute with Bain, his employer. Bain dismissed him, and he had to look out for another job. He was idle for 2 or 3 weeks, and during these, sooner than sit in the bungalow, he lunched about in the hotel or at the English club and drank. It was more out of pity than anything else that Miller, the German-American, took him into his office. But he was a businessman, and though Lawson's financial skill made him valuable, the circumstances were such that he could hardly refuse a smaller salary than he had had before, and Miller did not hesitate to offer it to him. Ethel and Brevard blamed him for taking it, since Peterson, the half-caste, offered him more. But he resented bitterly the thought of being under the orders of a half-caste. When Ethel nagged him, he burst out furiously. I'll see myself dead before I work for a nigger. You may have to, she said. And in 6 months he found himself forced to this final humiliation. The passion for liquor had been gaining on him. He was often heavy with drink, and he did his work badly. Miller warned him once or twice, and Lawson was not the man to accept remonstrance easily. One day, in the midst of an altercation, he put on his hat and walked out. But by now his reputation was well known, and he could find no one to engage him. For a while he idled, and then he had an attack of delirium tremens. When he recovered, shameful and weak, he could no longer resist the constant pressure, and he went to Pedersen and asked him for a job. Patterson was glad to have a white man in his store, and Lawson's skill at figures made him useful. From that time his degeneration was rapid. The white people gave him the cold shoulder. They were only prevented from cutting him completely by disdainful pity and by a certain dread of his angry violence when he was drunk. He became extremely susceptible and was always on the lookout for a affront. He lived entirely among the natives and half-castes, but he had no longer the prestige of the white man. They felt his loathing for them, and they resented his attitude of superiority. He was one of themselves now, and they did not see why he should put on airs. Brevald, who had been ingratiating obsequious, now treated him with contempt. Ethel had made a bad bargain. There were disgraceful scenes, and once or twice the two men came to blows. When there was a quarrel, Ethel took the part of her family. They found he was better drunk than sober, for when he was drunk he would lie on the bed or on the floor, sleeping heavily. Then he became aware that something was being hidden from him. When he got back to the bungalow for the wretched half-native supper which was his evening meal, often Ethel was not in. If he asked where she was, Brevald told him she had gone to spend the evening with one or other of her friends. Once he followed her to the house Brevald had mentioned and found she was not there. On her return he asked her where she had been, and she told him her father had made a mistake. She had been to so-and-so's. But he knew that she was lying. She was in her best clothes, her eyes were shining, and she looked lovely. "Don't try any monkey tricks on me, my girl," he said, "or I'll break every bone in your body." "You drunken beast," she said scornfully. He fancied that Mrs. Brevald and the old grandmother looked at him maliciously, and he ascribed Brevald's good humour with him, so unusual those days, to his satisfaction, having something up his sleeve against his son-in-law. And then, his suspicions aroused, he imagined that the white men gave him curious glances. When he came into the lounge of the hotel, the sudden silence which fell upon the company convinced him that he had been the subject of the conversation. Something was going on, and everyone knew it but himself. He was seized with furious jealousy. He believed that Ethel was carrying on with one of the white men, and he looked at one after the other with scrutinizing eyes. But there was nothing to give him even a hint. He was helpless, because he could find no one on whom definitely to fix his suspicions. He went about like a raving maniac, looking for someone on whom to vent his wrath. Chance caused him in the end to hit upon the man who of all others least deserved to suffer from his violence. One afternoon, when he was sitting in the hotel by himself moodily, Chaplin came in and sat down beside him. Perhaps Chaplin was the only man on the island who had any sympathy for him. They ordered drinks and chatted a few minutes about the races that were shortly to be run. Then Chaplin said, "I guess we shall all have to fork out money for new dresses." Lawson sniggered, since Mrs. Chaplin held the purse strings. If she wanted a new frock for the occasion she would certainly not ask her husband for the money. "How's your missus?" asked Chaplin, desiring to be friendly. "What the hell's that got to do with you?" said Lawson, knitting his dark brows. "I was only asking a civil question." "Well, keep your civil questions to yourself." Chaplin was not a patient man. His long residence in the tropics, the whisky bottle, and his domestic affairs had given him a temper hardly more under control than Lawson's. "Look here, my boy, when you're in my hotel you behave like a gentleman, or you'll find yourself in the street before you can say knife." Lawson's lowering face grew dark and red. "Let me just tell you once for all, and you can pass it on to the others," he said, panting with rage. "If any of you fellows come messing round with my wife, he'd better look out." "Who do you think wants to mess around with your wife?" "I'm not such a fool as you think. I can see a stone wall in front of me as well as most men, and I warn you strict, that's all. I'm not going to put up with any hanky-panky, not on your life. Look here, you'd better clear out of here and come back when you're sober." "I shall clear out when I choose and not a minute before," said Lawson. It was an unfortunate boast, for Chaplin, in the course of his experience as a hotel keeper, had acquired a peculiar skill in dealing with gentlemen whose room he preferred to their company, and the words were hardly out of Lawson's mouth before he found himself caught by the collar and arm and hustled not without force into the street. He stumbled down the steps into the blinding glare of the sun. It was in consequence of this that he had his first violent scene with Ethel. Smarting with humiliation and unwilling to go back to the hotel, he went home that afternoon earlier than usual. He found Ethel dressing to go out. As a rule, she lay about in the Mother Hubbard, barefoot, with a flower in her dark hair. But now, in white silk stockings and high-heeled shoes, she was doing up a pink muslin dress which was the newest she had. "You're making yourself very smart," he said. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to the Crossleys. I'll come with you." "Why?" she asked coolly. "I don't want you to gad about by yourself all the time. You're not asked. I don't care a damn about that. You're not going without me. You'd better lie down till I'm ready." She thought he was drunk, and if he once settled himself on the bed would quickly drop off to sleep. He sat down on a chair and began to smoke a cigarette. She watched him with increasing irritation. When she was ready, he got up. It happened by an unusual chance that there was no one in the bungalow. Brevald was working on the plantation and his wife had gone to Apia. Ethel faced him. "I'm not going with you. You're drunk." "That's a lie. You're not going without me." She shrugged her shoulders and tried to pass him, but he caught her by the arm and held her. "Let me go, you devil," she said, breaking into Samoan. "Why do you want to go without me? Haven't I told you I'm not going to put up with any monkey tricks?" She clenched her fist and hit him in the face. He lost all control of himself. All his love, all his hatred welled up in him and he was beside himself. "I'll teach you," he shouted. "I'll teach you." He seized a riding whip which happened to be under his hand and struck her with it. She screamed, and the scream maddened him so that he went on striking her again and again. Her shrieks rang through the bungalow and he cursed her as he hit. Then he flung her on the bed. She lay there sobbing with pain and terror. He threw the whip away from him and rushed out of the room. Ethel heard him go and she stopped crying. She looked round cautiously. Then she raised herself. She was sore, but she had not been badly hurt, and she looked at her dress to see if it was damaged. The native women are not unused to blows. What he had done did not outrage her. When she looked at herself in the glass and arranged her hair, her eyes were shining. There was a strange look in them. Perhaps then she was nearer loving him than she had ever been before. But Lawson, driven forth blindly, stumbled through the plantation and suddenly exhausted, weak as a child, flung himself on the ground at the foot of a tree. He was miserable and ashamed. He thought of Ethel, and in the yielding tenderness of his love all his bones seemed to grow soft within him. He thought of the past, of his hopes, and he was aghast at what he had done. He wanted her more than ever. He wanted to take her in his arms. He must go to her at once. He got up. He was so weak that he staggered as he walked. He went into the house and she was sitting in their cramped bedroom in front of her looking-glass. "Oh, Ethel, forgive me. I'm so awfully ashamed of myself. I didn't know what I was doing." He fell on his knees before her and timidly stroked the skirt of her dress. "I can't bear to think of what I did. It's awful. I think I was mad. There's no one in the world I love as I love you. I should do anything to save you from pain and I've hurt you. I can never forgive myself. But for God's sake, say you'll forgive me." He heard her shrieks still. It was unendurable. She looked at him silently. He tried to take her hands and the tears streamed from his eyes. In his humiliation he hid his face in her lap and his frail body shook with sobs. An expression of utter contempt came over her face. She had the native woman's disdain of a man who abased himself before a woman, a weak creature, and for a moment she had been on the point of thinking there was something in him. He grovelled at her feet like a cur. She gave him a little scornful kick. "Get out," she said. "I hate you." He tried to hold her, but she pushed him aside. She stood up. She began to take off her dress. She kicked off her shoes and slipped the stockings off her feet. Then she slipped on her old Mother Hubbard. "Where are you going?" "What's that got to do with you? I'm going down to the pool." "Let me come too," he said. He asked as though he were a child. "Can't you even leave me that?" He hid his face in his hands, crying miserably, while she, her eyes hard and cold, stepped past him and went out. From that time she entirely despised him, and though herded together in the small bungalow, Lawson and Ethel, with her 2 children, Brevald, his wife and her mother, and the vague relations and hangers-on who were always in and about, they had to live cheek by jowl. Lawson, ceasing to be of any account, was hardly noticed. He left in the morning after breakfast and came back only to have supper. He gave up the struggle. And when for want of money he could not go to the English club, he spent the evening playing hearts with old Brevald and natives. Except when he was drunk he was cowed and listless. Ethel treated him like a dog. She submitted at times to his fits of wild passion, and she was frightened by the gusts of hatred with which they were followed. But when afterwards he was cringing and lachrymose, she had such a contempt for him that she could have spat in his face. Sometimes he was violent, but now she was prepared for him, and when he hit her, she kicked and scratched and beat. They had horrible battles in which he had not always the best of it. Very soon it was known all over Apia that they got on badly. There was little sympathy for Lawson, and at the hotel the general surprise was that old Brevald did not kick him out of the place. "Brevald's pretty ugly customer," said one of the men. "I shouldn't be surprised if we put a bullet into Lawson's carcass one of these days." Ethel still went in the evenings to bathe in the silent pool. It seemed to have an attraction for her that was not quite human. Just that attraction you might imagine that a mermaid who had won a soul would have for the cool salt waves of the sea. And sometimes Lawson went also. I do not know what urged him to go, for Ethel was obviously irritated by his presence. Perhaps it was because in that spot he hoped to regain a clean rapture which had filled his heart when first he saw her. Perhaps only, with the madness of those who love them that love them not, from the feeling that his obstinacy could force love. One day he strolled down there with a feeling that was rare with him now. He felt suddenly at peace with the world. The evening was drawing in and the dusk seemed to cling to the leaves of the coconut trees like a little thin cloud. A faint breeze stirred them noiselessly. A crescent moon hung just over their tops. He made his way to the bank. He saw Ethel in the water, floating on her back. Her hair streamed out all round her, and she was holding in her hand a large hibiscus. He stopped a moment to admire her. She was like Ophelia. "Hello, Ethel," he cried joyfully. She made a sudden movement and dropped the red flower. It floated idly away. She swam a stroke or two, till she knew there was ground within her depth, and then stood up. "Go away," she said. "Go away." He laughed. "Don't be selfish. There's plenty of room for both of us." "Why can't you leave me alone? I want to be by myself." "Hang it all, I want to bathe," he answered, good-humouredly. "Go down to the bridge. I don't want you here." "I'm sorry for that," he said, smiling still. He was not in the least angry, and he hardly noticed that she was in a passion. He began to take off his coat. "Go away," he shrilled. "I won't have you here. Can't you even leave me this? Go away." "Don't be silly, darling." She bent down and picked up a sharp stone and flung it quickly at him. He had no time to duck. It hit him on the temple. With a cry, he put his hand to his head, and when he took it away it was wet with blood. Ethel stood still, panting with rage. He turned very pale. and without a word, taking up his coat, went away. Ethel let herself fall back into the water, and the stream carried her slowly down to the ford. The stone had made a jagged wound, and for some days Lawson went about with a bandaged head. He had invented a likely story to account for the accident, and the fellows at the club asked him about it, but he had no occasion to use it. No one referred to the matter. He saw them cast surreptitious glances at his head, but not a word was said. The silence could only mean that they knew how he came by his wound. He was certain now that Ethel had a lover, and they all knew who it was. There was not the smallest indication to guide him. He never saw Ethel with anyone. No one showed a wish to be with her, or treated him in a manner that seemed strange. Wild rage seized him, and having no one to vent it on, he drank more and more heavily. A little while before I came to the island he had had another attack of delirium tremens. I met Ethel at the house of a man called Custer, who lived 2 or 3 miles from Apia with a native wife. I had been playing tennis with him, and when we were tired he suggested a cup of tea. We went into the house, and in the untidy living room found Ethel chatting with Mrs. Custer. "Hello, Ethel," he said. "I didn't know you were here." I could not help looking at her with curiosity. I tried to see what there was in her to have excited in Lawson such a devastating passion, but who can explain these things? It was true that she was lovely. She reminded one of the red hibiscus, the common flower of the hedgerow in Samoa, with its grace and its languor and its passion. But what surprised me most, taking into consideration the story I knew, even then, a good deal of, was her freshness and simplicity. She was quiet and a little shy. There was nothing coarse or loud about her. She had not the exuberance common to the half-caste, and it was almost impossible to believe that she could be the virago that the horrible scenes between husband and wife, which were now common knowledge, indicated. In her pretty pink frock and high-heeled shoes she looked quite European. You could hardly have guessed at that dark background of native life in which she felt herself so much more at home. I did not imagine that she was at all intelligent, and I should not have been surprised if a man, after living with her for some time, had found the passion which had drawn him to her sink into boredom. It suggested itself to me that in her elusiveness, like a thought that presents itself to consciousness and vanishes before it can be captured by words, lay her peculiar charm. But perhaps that was merely fancy. And if I had known nothing about her, I should have seen in her only a pretty little half-caste like another. She talked to me of the various things which they talk of to the stranger in Samoa, of the journey, and whether I had slid down the water rock in Papicia, and if I meant to stay in a native village. She talked to me of Scotland, and perhaps I noticed in her a tendency to enlarge on the sumptuousness of her establishment there. She asked me naively if I knew Mrs. This and Mrs. That, with whom she had been acquainted when she lived in the north. Then Miller, the fat German-American, came in. He shook hands all round very cordially and sat down, asking in his loud, cheerful voice for a whiskey and soda. He was very fat and he sweated profusely. He took off his gold-rimmed spectacles and wiped them. You saw then that his little eyes, benevolent behind the large round glasses, were shrewd and cunning. The party had been somewhat dull till he came, but he was a good story-teller and a jovial fellow. Soon he had the 2 women, Ethel and my friend's wife, laughing delightedly at his sallies. He had the reputation on the island of a ladies' man, and you could see how this fat, gross fellow, old and ugly, had yet the possibility of fascination. His humour was on a level with the understanding of his company, an affair of vitality and assurance, and his western accent gave a peculiar point to what he said. At last he turned to me. "Well, if you want to get back for dinner, we'd better be getting. I'll take you along in my machine if you like." I thanked him and got up. He shook hands with the others, went out of the room, massive and strong in his walk, and climbed into his car. "Pretty little thing, Lawson's wife," I said, as we drove along. too bad the way he treats her, knocks her about, gets my dander up when I hear of a man hitting a woman. We went on a little, then he said, he was a darned fool to marry her. I said so at the time. If he hadn't, he'd have had the whip hand over her. He's yaller, that's what he is, yaller. The year was drawing to its end, and the time approached when I was to leave Samoa. My boat was scheduled to sail for Sydney on the 4th of January. Christmas Day had been celebrated and the hotel with suitable ceremonies, but it was looked upon as no more than a rehearsal for New Year, and the men who were accustomed to together in the lounge determined on New Year's Eve to make a night of it. There was an uproarious dinner, after which the party sauntered down to the English Club, a simple little frame house, to play pool. There was a great deal of talking, laughing and betting, but some very poor play, except on the part of Miller, who had drunk as much as any of them, all far younger than he, but had kept unimpaired the keenness of his eye and the sureness of his hand. He pocketed the young men's money with humour and urbanity. After an hour of this I grew tired and went out. I crossed the road and came on to the beach. 3 coconut trees grew there, like 3 moon maidens waiting for their lovers to ride out of the sea, and I sat at the foot of one of them, watching the lagoon and the nightly assemblage of the stars. I do not know where Lawson had been during the evening, but between 10 and 11 he came along to the club. He shambled down the dusty, empty road, feeling dull and bored, and when he reached the club, before going into the billiard room, went into the bar to have a drink by himself. He had a shyness now about joining the company of white men, where there were a lot of them together, and needed a stiff dose of whisky to give him confidence. He was standing with a glass in his hand when Miller came in to him. He was in his shirt sleeves and still held his cue. He gave the bartender a glance. "Get out, Jack," he said. The bartender, a native in a white jacket and a red lava, without a word slid out of the small room. "Look here, I've been wanting to have a few words with you, Lawson," said the big American. "Well, that's one of the few things you can have free, gratis, and for nothing on this damned island." Miller fixed his gold spectacles more firmly on his nose and held Lawson with his cold, determined eyes. "See here, young fellow, I understand you've been knocking Mrs. Lawson about again. I'm not going to stand for that. If you don't stop it right now I'll break every bone of your dirty little body." Then Lawson knew what he had been trying to find out so long. It was Miller. The appearance of a man, fat, bald-headed, with his round bare face and double chin and the gold spectacles, his aged, benign, shrewd look, like that of a renegade priest, and the thought of Ethel, so slim and virginal, filled him with a sudden horror. Whatever his faults, Lawson was no coward, and without a word he hit out violently at Miller. Miller quickly warded a blow with the hand that held the cue, and then with a great swing of his right arm brought his fist down on Lawson's ear. Lawson was 4 inches shorter than the American, and he was slightly built, frail and weakened not only by illness and the enervating tropics, but by drink. He felt like a log and lay half dazed at the foot of the bar. Miller took off his spectacles and wiped them with his handkerchief. "I guess you know what to expect now. You've had your warning and you'd better take it." He took up his cue and went back into the billiard room. There was so much noise then that no one knew what had happened. Lawson picked himself up. He put his hand to his ear, which was singing still. Then he slunk out of the club. I saw a man cross the road, a patch of white against the darkness of the night, but did not know who it was. He came down to the beach, past me sitting at the foot of the tree, and looked down. I saw then that it was Lawson, but since he was doubtless drunk, did not speak. He went on, walked irresolutely 2 or 3 steps, and turned back. He came up to me and bending down stared in my face. "I thought it was you," he said. He sat down and took out his pipe. "It was hot and noisy in the club," I volunteered. "Why are you sitting here?" "I was waiting about for the midnight mass at the cathedral. If you like, I'll come with you." Lawson was quite sober. We sat for a while smoking in silence. Now and then in the lagoon was the splash of some big fish, and a little way out towards the opening in the reef was the light of a schooner. "You're sailing next week, aren't you?" he said. "Yes. It would be jolly to go home once more, but I could never stand it now, the cold, you know." "It's odd to think that in England now they are shivering round the fire," I said. There was not even a breath of wind. The balminess of the night was like a spell. I wore nothing but a thin shirt and a suit of ducks. I enjoyed the exquisite languor of the night and stretched my limbs voluptuously. "This isn't the sort of New Year's Eve that persuades one to make good resolutions for the future," I smiled. He made no answer, but I do not know what train of thought my casual remark had suggested in him, for presently he began to speak. He spoke in a low voice, without any expression, but his accents were educated, and it was a relief to hear him after the twang and the vulgar intonations which for some time had wounded my ears. "I've made an awful hash of things. That's obvious, isn't it? I'm right down at the bottom of the pit, and there's no getting out for me. Black as the pit from pole to pole." I felt him smile as he made the quotation, and the strange thing is that I don't see how I went wrong. I held my breath, for to me there is nothing more awe-inspiring than when a man discovers to you the nakedness of his soul. Then you see that no one is so trivial or debased, but that in him is a spark of something to excite compassion. It would have been so rotten if I could see that it was all my own fault. It's true I drink, but I shouldn't have taken to it if things had gone differently. I wasn't really fond of liquor. I suppose I ought not to have married Ethel. If I'd kept her, it would be all right. But I did love her so. His voice faltered. "She's not a bad lot, you know, not really. It's just rotten luck. We might have been as happy as lords. When she bolted, I suppose I ought to have let her go, but I couldn't do that. I was dead stuck on her then, and there was the kid." "Are you fond of the kid?" I asked. "I was. There are two, you know, but they don't mean so much to me now. You'd take them for natives anywhere. I have to talk to them in Samoan." "Is it too late for you to start fresh? Couldn't you make a dash for it and leave the place?" "I haven't the strength. I'm done for." "Are you still in love with your wife?" "Not now, not now." He repeated the two words with a kind of horror in his voice. "I haven't even got that now. I'm down and out." The bells of the cathedral was ringing. "If you really want to come to the midnight mass, we'd better go along," I said. "Come on." We got up and walked along the road. The cathedral, all white, stood facing the sea not without impressiveness, and beside it the Protestant chapels had the look of meeting houses. In the road were 2 or 3 cars and a great number of traps, and traps were put up against the walls at the side. People had come from all parts of the island for the service, and through the great open doors we saw that the place was crowded. The high altar was all ablaze with light. There were a few whites and a good many half-caste, but the great majority were natives. All the men wore trousers, for the church has decided that the lava is indecent. We found chairs at the back, near the open door, and sat down. Presently, following Lawson's eyes, I saw Ethel come in with a party of half-castes. They were all very much dressed up, the men in high stiff collars and shiny boots, the women in large gay hats. Ethel nodded and smiled to her friends as she passed up the aisle. The service began. When it was over, Lawson and I stood on one side for a while to watch the crowd stream out. Then he held out his hand. "Good night," he said. "I hope you'll have a pleasant journey home." "Oh, but I shall see you before I go," he sniggered. "The question is if you'll see me drunk or sober." He turned and left me. I had a recollection of those very large black eyes shining wildly under the shaggy brows. I paused irresolutely. I did not feel sleepy, and I thought I would at all events go along to the club for an hour before turning in. When I got there, I found the billiard room empty, but half a dozen men were sitting round a table in the lounge, playing poker. Miller looked up as I came in. "Sit down and take a hand," he said. "All right." I bought some chips and began to play. Of course it is the most fascinating game in the world, and my hour lengthened out to 2, and then to 3. The native bartender, cheery and wide awake notwithstanding the time, was at our elbow to supply us with drinks, and from somewhere or other he produced a ham and a loaf of bread. We played on. Most of the party had drunk more than was good for them, and the play was high and reckless. I played modestly, neither wishing to win nor anxious to lose, but I watched Miller with a fascinated interest. He drank glass for glass with the rest of the company, but remained cool and level-headed. His pile of chips increased in size, and he had a neat little paper in front of him on which he had marked various sums lent to the players in distress. He beamed amiably at the young men whose money he was taking. He kept up interminably his stream of jest and anecdote, but he never missed a draw. He never let an expression of the face pass him. At last dawn crept into the windows, gently, with a sort of deprecating shyness, as though it had no business there, and then it was day. "Well," said Miller, "I reckon we've seen the old year out in style. Now let's have a round of jackpots and me for my mosquito net. I'm 50, remember? I can't keep these late hours." The morning was beautiful and fresh when we stood on the veranda, and the lagoon was like a sheet of multicoloured glass. Someone suggested a dip before going to bed, but none cared to bathe in the lagoon, sticky and treacherous to the feet. Miller had his car at the door, and he offered to take us down to the pool. We jumped in and drove along the deserted road. When we reached the pool, it seemed as though the day had hardly risen there yet. Under the trees the water was all in shadow, and the night had the effect of lurking still. We were in great spirits. We had no towels or any costume, and in my prudence I wondered how we were going to dry ourselves. None of us had much on, and it did not take us long to snatch off our clothes. Nelson, the little supercargo, was stripped first. "I'm going down to the bottom," he said. He dived, and in a moment another man dived, too, but shallow, and was out of the water before him. Then Nelson came up and scrambled to the side. "I say, get me out," he said. "What's up?" Something was evidently the matter. His face was terrified. 2 fellows gave him their hands, and he slithered up. "I say, there's a man down there." "Don't be a fool. You're drunk." "Well, if there isn't, I'm in for tease, but I tell you, there's a man down there. It just scared me out of my wits." Miller looked at him for a moment. The little man was all white. He was actually trembling. "Come on, Custer," said Miller to the big Australian. "We'd better go down and see." "He was standing up," said Nelson, "all dressed. I saw him. He tried to catch hold of me." "Hold your row," said Miller. "Are you ready?" They dived in. We waited on the bank, silent. It really seemed as though they were under water longer than any men could breathe. Then Custer came up, and immediately after him, red in the face as though he were going to have a fit, Miller. They were pulling something behind them. Another man jumped in to help them, and the 3 together dragged their burden to the side. They shoved it up. Then we saw that it was Lawson, with a great stone tied up in his coat and bound to his feet. "He was set on making a good job of it," said Miller, as he wiped the water from his short-sighted eyes. Section 8. Section 9 of the Trembling of a Leaf. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lilith Randa. The Trembling of a Leaf by W. Somerset Maugham. Section 9. Honolulu. The wise traveller travels only in imagination. An old Frenchman, he was really a Savoyard, once wrote a book called Voyage autour de ma chambre. I have not read it and do not even know what it is about, but the title stimulates my fancy. In such a journey I could circumnavigate the globe. An icon by the chimney-piece can take me to Russia, with its great forests of birch and its white domed churches. The Volga is wide, and at the end of a straggling village, in a wine shop, bearded men in rough sheepskin coats sit drinking. I stand on the little hill from which Napoleon first saw Moscow, and I look upon the vastness of the city. I will go down and see the people whom I know more intimately than so many of my friends, Alyosha and Vronsky and a dozen more. But my eyes fall on a piece of porcelain and I smell the acrid odours of China. I am borne in a chair along a narrow causeway between the paddy fields, or else I skirt a tree-clad mountain. My bearers chat gaily as they trudge along in the bright morning, and every now and then, distant and mysterious, I hear the deep sound of a monastery bell. In the streets of Peking there is a motley crowd, and it scatters to allow passage to a string of camels, stepping delicately, that bring skins and strange drugs from the stony deserts of Mongolia. In England and London there are certain afternoons in winter when the clouds hang heavy and low, and the light is so bleak that your heart sinks. But then you can look out of your window, and you see the coconut trees crowded upon the beach of a coral island. The sand is silvery, and when you walk along in the sunshine, it is so dazzling that you can hardly bear to look at it. Overhead, the mynah birds are making a great to-do, and the surf beats ceaselessly against the reef. Those are the best journeys, the journeys that you take at your own fireside, for then you lose none of your illusions. But there are people who take salt in their coffee. They say it gives it a tang, a savour which is peculiar and fascinating. In the same way there are certain places, surrounded by a halo of romance, to which the inevitable disillusionment which you must experience on seeing them gives a singular spice. You had expected something wholly beautiful, and you get an impression which is infinitely more complicated than any that beauty can give you. It is like the weakness in the character of a great man, which may make him less admirable, but certainly makes him more interesting. Nothing had prepared me for Honolulu. It is so far away from Europe. It is reached after so long a journey from San Francisco. So strange and so charming associations are attached to the name that at first I could hardly believe my eyes. I do not know that I have formed in my mind any very exact picture of what I expected, but what I found caused me a great surprise. It is a typical Western city. Shacks are cheek by jowl with stone mansions. Dilapidated frame houses stand next door to smart stores with plate glass windows. Electric cars rumble noisily along the streets, and motors, Fords, Buicks, Packards line the pavement. The shops are filled with all the necessities of American civilization. Every third house is a bank, and every fifth the agency of a steamship company. Along the streets crowd an unimaginable assortment of people. The Americans, ignoring the climate, wear black coats and high starched collars, straw hats, soft hats, and bowlers. The Kanakas, pale brown with crisp hair, have nothing on but a shirt and a pair of trousers. But the half-breeds are very smart with flaring ties and patent leather boots. The Japanese, with their obsequious smile, are neat and trim in white duck, while their women walk a step or two behind them, in native dress, with a baby on their backs. The Japanese children in bright-coloured frocks, their little heads shaven, look like quaint dolls. Then there are the Chinese. The men, fat and prosperous, wear their American clothes orderly, but the women are enchanting with their tightly dressed black hair, so neat that you feel it can never be disarranged, and they are very clean in their tunics and trousers, white or powder blue or black. Lastly, there are the Filipinos. The men in huge straw hats, the women in bright yellow muslin with great puffed sleeves. It is the meeting place of East and West. The very new rubs shoulders with the immeasurably old. And if you have not found the romance you expected, you have come upon something singularly intriguing. All these strange people live close to each other, with different languages and different thoughts. They believe in different gods and they have different values. Two passions alone they share, love and hunger. And somehow as you watch them, you have an impression of extraordinary vitality. Though the air is so soft and the sky so blue, you have, I know not why, a feeling of something hotly passionate that beats like a throbbing pulse through the crowd. There was a native policeman at the corner, standing on a platform, with a white club to direct the traffic, gives the scene an air of respectability. You cannot but feel that it is a respectability only of the surface. A little below, there is darkness and mystery. It gives you just that thrill, with a little catch at the heart, that you have when, at night, in the forest, the silence trembles on a sudden with the slow, insistent beating of a drum. You are all expectant of I know not what. If I have dwelt on the incongruity of Honolulu, it is because just this, to my mind, gives its point to the story I want to tell. It is a story of primitive superstition, and it startles me that anything of the sort should survive in a civilization which, if not very distinguished, is certainly very elaborate. I cannot get over the fact that such incredible things should happen, or at least be thought to happen, right in the middle, so to speak, of telephones, tram cars and daily papers. And the friend who showed me Honolulu had the same incongruity which I felt from the beginning was his most striking characteristic. He was an American named Winter, and I had brought a letter of introduction to him from an acquaintance in New York. He was a man between 40 and 50, with scanty black hair, grey at the temples, and a sharp-featured, thin face. His eyes had a twinkle in them, and his large horn spectacles gave him a demureness which was not a little diverting. He was tall, rather than otherwise, and very spare. He was born in Honolulu, and his father had a large store which sold hosiery and all such goods, from tennis rackets to tarpaulins, as a man of fashion could require. It was a prosperous business, and I could well understand the indignation of Winter Père when his son, refusing to go into it, had announced his determination to be an actor. My friend spent 20 years on the stage, sometimes in New York, but more often on the road, for his gifts were small. But at last, being no fool, he came to the conclusion that it was better to sell sock suspenders in Honolulu than to play small parts in Cleveland, Ohio. He left the stage and went into the business. I think after the hazardous existence he had lived so long, he thoroughly enjoyed the luxury of driving a large car and living in a beautiful house near the golf course. And I'm quite sure, since he was a man of parts, he managed the business competently. But he could not bring himself entirely to break his connection with the arts, and since he might no longer act, he began to paint. He took me to a studio and showed me his work. It was not at all bad, but not what I should have expected from him. He painted nothing but still life, very small pictures, perhaps 8 by 10, and he painted very delicately, with the utmost finish. He had evidently a passion for detail. His fruit pieces reminded you of the fruit in a picture by Ghirlandaio. While you marvelled a little at his patience, you could not help being impressed by his dexterity. I imagined that he failed as an actor because his effects, carefully studied, were neither bold nor broad enough to get across the footlights. I was entertained by the proprietary, yet ironical air with which he showed me the city. He thought in his heart that there was none in the United States to equal it, but he saw quite clearly that his attitude was comic. He drove me around to the various buildings and swelled with satisfaction when I expressed a proper admiration for their architecture. He showed me the houses of rich men. "That's the Stubbs house," he said. "It cost $100,000 to build. The Stubbs are one of our best families. Old man Stubbs came here as a missionary more than 70 years ago." He hesitated a little and looked at me with twinkling eyes through his big round spectacles. "All our best families are missionary families," he said. "You're not very much in Honolulu unless your father or your grandfather converted the heathen." "Is that so? Do you know your Bible?" "Fairly," I answered. "There is a text which says, 'The fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge.' I guess it runs differently in Honolulu. The fathers brought Christianity to the Kanaka and the children jumped his land." "Heaven helps those who help themselves," I murmured. "It surely does. By the time the natives of this island had embraced Christianity, they had nothing else they could afford to embrace. The kings gave the missionaries land as a mark of esteem, and the missionaries bought land by way of laying up treasure in heaven. It surely was a good investment. One missionary left the business, I think one may call it a business without offence, and became a land agent. But that is an exception. Mostly it was their sons who looked after the commercial side of the concern. Oh, it's a fine thing to have a father who came here 50 years ago to spread the faith." But he looked at his watch. "Gee, it's stopped. That means it's time to have a cocktail." We sped along an excellent road bordered with red hibiscus and came back into the town. "Have you been to the Union Saloon?" "Not yet. We'll go there." I knew it was the most famous spot in Honolulu and I entered it with a lively curiosity. You get to it by a narrow passage from King Street, and in the passage are offices, so that thirsty souls may be supposed to bound for one of these just as well as for the saloon. It is a large square room with 3 entrances, and opposite the bar, which runs the length of it, 2 corners have been partitioned off into little cubicles. Legend states that they were built so that King Kalakaua might drink there without being seen by his subjects. And it is pleasant to think that in one or other of these he may have sat over his bottle, a coal-black potentate, with Robert Louis Stevenson. There is a portrait of him in oils, in a rich gold frame, but there are also 2 prints of Queen Victoria. On the walls, besides, are old-line engravings of the 18th century, one of which, and heaven knows how it got there, is after a theatrical picture by De Wilde, and there are oleographs from the Christmas supplements of the Graphic and the Illustrated London News of 20 years ago. Then there are advertisements of whiskey, gin, champagne and beer, and photographs of baseball teams and of native orchestras. The place seemed to belong not to the modern, hustling world that I had left in the bright street outside, but to one that was dying. It had the savour of the day before yesterday. Dingy and dimly lit, it had a vaguely mysterious air, and you could imagine that it would be a fit scene for shady transactions. It suggested a more lurid time when ruthless men carried their lives in their hands and violent deeds diapered the monotony of life. When I went in, the saloon was fairly full. A group of businessmen stood together at the bar discussing affairs, and in a corner 2 Kanakas were drinking. 2 or 3 men, who might have been storekeepers, were shaking dice. The rest of the company plainly followed the sea. There were captains of tramps, first mates, and engineers, behind the bar, busily making the Honolulu cocktail, for which the place was famous, served 2 large half-castes, in white, fat, clean-shaven, and dark-skinned, with thick curly hair and large bright eyes. Winter seemed to know more than half the company, and when we made our way to the bar a little fat man in spectacles, who was standing by himself, offered him a drink. "No, you have one with me, Captain," said Winter. He turned to me. "I want you to know Captain Butler." The little man shook hands with me. We began to talk, but my attention distracted by my surroundings, I took small notice of him, and after we had each ordered a cocktail, we separated. When we had got into the motor again and were driving away, Winter said to me, "I'm glad we ran up against Butler. I wanted you to meet him. What do you think of him?" "I don't know that I thought very much of him at all," I answered. "Do you believe in the supernatural?" I don't exactly know that I do, I smiled. A very queer thing happened to him a year or two ago. You ought to have him tell you about it. What sort of thing? Winter did not answer my question. I have no explanation of it myself, he said, but there is no doubt about the facts. Are you interested in things like that? Things like what? Spells and magic and all that. I've never met anyone who wasn't. Winter paused for a moment. I guess I won't tell you myself. You ought to hear it from his own lips so that you can judge. How are you fixed up for tonight? I've got nothing on at all. Well, I get hold of him between now and then and see if we can't go down to his ship. Winter told me something about him. Captain Butler has spent all his life on the Pacific. He had been in much better circumstances than he was now, for he had been first officer and then captain of a passenger boat plying along the coast of California. But he had lost his ship, and a number of passengers had been drowned. Drink, I guess, said Winter. Of course there had been an enquiry, which had cost him his certificate, and then he drifted further afield. For some years he had knocked about the South Seas, but he was now in command of a small schooner, which sailed between Honolulu and the various islands of the group. It belonged to a Chinese to whom the fact that his skipper had no certificate meant only that he could be had for lower wages, and to have a white man in charge was always an advantage. And now that I had heard this about him, I took the trouble to remember more exactly what he was like. I recalled his round spectacles and the round blue eyes behind them, and so gradually reconstructed him before my mind. He was a little man, without angles, plump, with a round face like the full moon and a little fat round nose. He had fair short hair, and he was red-faced and clean-shaven. He had plump hands, dimpled on the knuckles, and short fat legs. He was a jolly soul, and the tragic experience he had gone through seemed to have left him unscarred. So he must have been 34 or 35. He looked much younger. But after all I had given him but a superficial attention, and now that I knew of this catastrophe, which had obviously ruined his life, I promised myself that when I saw him again I would take more careful note of him. It is very curious to observe the differences of emotional response that you find in different people. Some can go through terrific battles, the fear of imminent death and unimaginable horrors, and preserve their soul unscathed, while with others the trembling of the moon on a solitary sea, or the song of a bird in a thicket, will cause a convulsion great enough to transform their entire being. Is it due to strength or weakness, want of imagination, or instability of character? I do not know. When I called up in my fancy that scene of shipwreck, with the shrieks of the drowning and the terror, and then later the ordeal of the enquiry, the bitter grief of those who sorrowed for the lost, and the harsh things he must have read of himself in the papers, the shame and the disgrace, it came to me with a shock to remember that Captain Butler had talked with the frank obscenity of a schoolboy of the Hawaiian girls, and of Yuval, the red light district, and of his successful adventures. He laughed readily, and one would have thought he could never laugh again. I remembered his shining white teeth. They were his best feature. He began to interest me, and thinking of him and of his gay insouciance, I forgot the particular story, to hear which I was to see him again. I wanted to see him rather to find out if I could a little more what sort of a man he was. Winter made the necessary arrangements, and after dinner we went down to the waterfront. The ship's boat was waiting for us, and we rowed out. The schooner was anchored some way across the harbour, not far from the breakwater. We came alongside, and I heard the sound of our ukulele. We clambered up the ladder. "I guess he's in the cabin," said Winter, leading the way. It was a small cabin, bedraggled and dirty, with a table against one side and a broad bench all round upon which slept, I supposed, such passengers as were ill-advised not to travel in such a ship. A petroleum lamp, gave a dim light. The ukulele was being played by a native girl, and Butler was lolling on the seat, half lying, with his head on her shoulder and an arm round her waist. "Don't let us disturb you, Captain," said Winter, facetiously. "Come right in," said Butler, getting up and shaking hands with us. "What do you have?" It was a warm night, and through the open door you saw countless stars in a heaven that was still almost blue. Captain Butler wore a sleeveless undershirt, showing his fat, white arms, and a pair of incredibly dirty trousers. His feet were bare, but on his curly head he wore a very old and very shapeless felt hat. "Let me introduce you to my girl. Ain't she the peach?" We shook hands with a very pretty person. She was a good deal taller than the captain, and even the Mother Hubbard, which the missionaries of a past generation had, in the interests of decency, forced on the unwilling natives, could not conceal the beauty of her form. One could not but suspect that age would burden her with a certain corpulence, but now she was graceful and alert. Her brown skin had an exquisite translucency, and her eyes were magnificent. Her black hair, very thick and rich, was coiled round her head in a massive plait. When she smiled in a greeting that was charmingly natural, she showed teeth that were small, even, and white. She was certainly a most attractive creature. It was easy to see that the captain was madly in love with her. He could not take his eyes off her. He wanted to touch her all the time. That was very easy to understand. But what seemed to me stranger was that the girl was apparently in love with him. There was a light in her eyes that was unmistakable, and her lips were slightly parted as though in a sigh of desire. It was thrilling. It was even a little moving. I could not help feeling somewhat in the way. What had a stranger to do with this lovesick pair? I wished that Winter had not brought me, and it seemed to me that the dingy cabin was transfigured, and now it seemed a fit and proper scene for such an extremity of passion. I thought I should never forget that schooner in the harbour of Honolulu, crowded with shipping, and yet, under the immensity of the starry sky, remote from all the world, I liked to think of those lovers sailing off together in the night over the empty spaces of the Pacific from one green hilly island to another. A faint breeze of romance softly fanned my cheek. And yet Butler was the last man in the world with whom you would have associated romance, and it was hard to see what there was in him to arouse love. In the clothes he wore, now he looked podgier than ever, and his round spectacles gave his round face the look of a prim cherub. He suggested rather a curate who had gone to the dogs. His conversation was peppered with the quaintest Americanisms, and it is because I despair of reproducing these that, at whatever loss of vividness, I mean to narrate the story he told me a little later in my own words. Moreover, he was unable to frame a sentence without an oath, though a good-natured one, and his speech, albeit offensive only to prudish ears, in print would seem coarse. He was a mirth-loving man, and perhaps that accounted not a little for his successful amours, since women, for the most part frivolous creatures, are excessively bored by the seriousness with which men treat them, and they can seldom resist the buffoon who makes them laugh. Their sense of humour is crude. Diana of Ephesus is always prepared to fling Prudence to the winds for the red-nosed comedian who sits on his hat. I realised that Captain Butler had charm. If I had not known the tragic story of the shipwreck, I should have thought he had never had a care in his life. Our host had rung the bell on our entrance, and now a Chinese cook came in with more glasses and several bottles of soda. The whisky and the captain's empty glass stood already on the table. But when I saw the Chinese, I positively started, for he was certainly the ugliest man I had ever seen. He was very short, but thick-set, and he had a bad limp. He wore a singlet and a pair of trousers that had been white, but were now filthy and perched on a shock of bristly grey hair, an old tweed deerstalker. It would have been grotesque on any Chinese, but on him it was outrageous. His broad, square face was very flat, as though it had been bashed in by a mighty fist, and he was deeply pitted with smallpox. But the most revolting thing in him was a very pronounced hair lip, which had never been operated on, so that his upper lip, cleft, went up in an angle to his nose, and in the opening was a huge yellow fang. It was horrible. It came in with the end of a cigarette at the corner of his mouth, and this, I do not know why, gave him a devilish expression. He poured out the whisky and opened a bottle of soda. "Don't drown it, John," said the captain. He said nothing, but handed a glass to each of us. Then he went out. "I saw you looking at my chink," said Butler, with a grin on his fat, shining face. "I should hate to meet him on a dark night," I said. "He sure is homely," said the captain, and for some reason he seemed to say it with a peculiar satisfaction. "But he's fine for one thing. I'll tell the world you just have to have a drink every time you look at him." But my eyes fell on a calabash that hung against the wall over the table, and I got up to look at it. I had been hunting for an older one, and this was better than any I had seen outside the museum. "It was given me by a chief over on one of the islands," said the captain, watching me. "I done him a good turn, and he wanted to give me something good." "He certainly did," I answered. I was wondering whether I could discreetly make Captain Butler an offer for it. I could not imagine that he set any store on such an article, when, as though he read my thoughts, he said, "I wouldn't sell that for $10,000. "I guess not," said Winter. "It would be a crime to sell it." "Why?" I asked. "That comes into the story," returned Winter. "Doesn't it, Captain?" "It surely does." "Let's hear it then." "The night's young yet," he answered. The night distinctly lost its youth before he satisfied my curiosity, and meanwhile we drank a great deal too much whisky, while Captain Butler narrated his experiences of San Francisco in the old days and of the South Seas. At last the girl fell asleep. She lay curled up on the seat, with her face on her brown arm, and her bosom rose and fell gently with her breathing. In sleep she looked sullen, but darkly beautiful. He had found her on one of the islands in the group among which, whenever there was cargo to be got, he wandered with his crazy old schooner. The Kanakas have little love for work, and the laborious Chinese, the cunning Japs, have taken the trade out of their hands. Her father had a strip of land on which he grew taro and bananas, and he had a boat in which he went fishing. He was vaguely related to the mate of the schooner, and it was he who took Captain Butler up to the shabby little frame house to spend an idle evening. They took a bottle of whisky with them, and the ukulele. The captain was not a shy man, and when he saw a pretty girl he made love to her. He could speak the native language fluently, and it was not long before he had overcome the girl's timidity. They spent the evening singing and dancing, and by the end of it she was sitting by his side, and he had his arm round her waist. It happened that they were delayed on the island for several days, and the captain, at no time a man to hurry, made no effort to shorten his stay. He was very comfortable in the snug little harbour, and life was long. He had a swim round his ship in the morning, and another in the evening. There was a chandler's shop on the waterfront where sailormen could get a drink of whisky, and he spent the best part of the day there, playing cribbage with the half-caste who owned it. At night the mate and he went up to the house where the pretty girl lived, and they sang a song or two and told stories. It was the girl's father who suggested that he should take her away with him. He discussed the matter in a friendly fashion, while the girl, nestling against the captain, urged him by the pressure of her hands and her soft, smiling glances. He had taken a fancy to her, and he was a domestic man. He was a little dull sometimes at sea, and it would be very pleasant to have a pretty little creature like that about the old ship. He was of a practical turn too, and he recognized that it would be useful to have someone around to darn his socks and look after his linen. He was tired of having his things washed by a Chink who tore everything to pieces. The natives washed much better, and now and then, when the captain went ashore at Honolulu, he liked to cut a dish in a smart duck suit. It was only a matter of arranging a price. The father wanted $250, and the captain, if a thrifty man, could not put his hand on such a sum. But he was a generous one, and with the girl's soft face against his, he was not inclined to haggle. He offered to give $150 there and then, and another 100 in 3 months. There was a good deal of argument, and the parties could not come to any agreement that night. But the idea had fired the captain, and he could not sleep as well as usual. He kept dreaming of the lovely girl, and each time he awoke, it was with the pressure of her soft, sensual lips on his. He cursed himself in the morning because a bad night at poker, the last time he was in Honolulu, had left him so short of ready money. And if the night before he had been in love with the girl, this morning he was crazy about her. "See here, Bananas," he said to the maid. "I've got to have that girl. You go and tell the old man I bring the doll up tonight and she can fix up. I figure we'll be ready to sail at dawn." I have no idea why the maid was known by this eccentric name. He was called Weir, but though he had that English surname, there was not a drop of white blood in him. He was a tall man and well made, though inclined to stoutness, but much darker than is usual in Hawaii. He was no longer young, and his crispy, curling thick hair was grey. His upper front teeth was cased in gold. He was very proud of them. He had a marked squint, and this gave him a saturnine expression. The captain, who was fond of a joke, finding it a constant source of humour, and hesitated the less to rally him on the defect because he realised that the maid was sensitive about it. Bananas, unlike most of the natives, was a taciturn fellow, and Captain Butler would have disliked him if it had been possible for a man of his good nature to dislike anyone. He liked to be at sea with someone he could talk to. He was a chatty, sociable creature, and it was enough to drive a missionary to drink to live there day after day with a chap who never opened his mouth. He did his best to wake the mate up. That is to say, he chaffed him without mercy. But it was poor fun to laugh by oneself, and he came to the conclusion that, drunk or sober, Bananas was no fit companion for a white man. But he was a good seaman, and the captain was shrewd enough to know the value of a mate he could trust. It was not rare for him to come aboard when they were sailing, fit for nothing but to fall into his bunk, and it was worth something to know that he could stay there till he had slept his liquor off, since Banana could be relied on. But he was an unsociable devil, and it would be a treat to have someone he could talk to. The girl would be fine. Besides, he wouldn't be so likely to get drunk when he went ashore if he knew there was a little girl waiting for him when he came on board again. He went to his friend the chandler, and over a pig of gin asked him for a loan. There were 1 or 2 useful things a ship's captain could do for a ship's chandler, and after a quarter of an hour's conversation in low tones, there is no object in letting all and sundry know your business, the captain crammed a wad of notes in his hip pocket, and that night, when he went back to his ship, the girl went with him. What Captain Butler, seeking for reasons to do what he had already made up his mind to, had anticipated, actually came to pass. He did not give up drinking, but he ceased to drink to excess. An evening with the boys, when he had been away from town 2 or 3 weeks, was pleasant enough, but it was pleasant too to get back to his little girl. He thought of her, sleeping so softly, and how, when he got into his cabin and leaned over her, she would open her eyes lazily and stretch out her arms for him. It was as good as a full hand. He found he was saving money, and since he was a generous man, he did the right thing by the little girl. He gave her some silver-backed brushes for her long hair, and a gold chain and a reconstructed ruby for her finger. Gee, but it was good to be alive. A year went by, a whole year, and he was not tired of her yet. He was not a man who analysed his feelings, but this was so surprising that it forced itself upon his attention. There must be something very wonderful about that girl. He couldn't help seeing that he was more wrapped up in her than ever, and sometimes the thought entered his mind that it might not be a bad thing if he married her. Then, one day, the maid did not come in to dinner or to tea. Butler did not bother himself about his absence at the first meal. But at the second he asked the Chinese cook, "Where's the maid?" "He no come tea?" "No want tea," said the Chink. "He ain't sick?" "No savvy." Next day Bananas turned up again, but he was more sullen than ever, and after dinner the captain asked the girl what was the matter with him. She smiled and shrugged her pretty shoulders. She told the captain that Bananas had taken a fancy to her, and he was sore because she had told him off. The captain was a good-humoured man, and he was not of a jealous nature. It struck him as exceeding funny that Bananas should be in love. A man who had a squint like that had a precious poor chance. When tea came round he chaffed him gaily. He pretended to speak in the air so that the maid should not be certain that he knew anything, but he dealt him some pretty shrewd blows. The girl did not think him as funny as he thought himself, and afterwards she begged him to say nothing more. He was surprised at her seriousness. She told him he did not know her people. When their passion was aroused they were capable of anything. She was a little frightened. This was so absurd to him that he laughed heartily. "If he comes bothering round you, just threaten to tell me. They'll fix him." "Better fire him, I think." "Not on your sweet life. I know a good sailor when I see one. But if he don't leave you alone, I give him the worst licking he's ever had." Perhaps the girl had a wisdom unusual in her sex. She knew that it was useless to argue with a man when his mind was made up, for it only increased his stubbornness, and she held her peace. And now on a shabby schooner, threading her way across the silent sea, among those lovely islands, was enacted a dark, tense drama of which the fat little captain remained entirely ignorant. The girl's resistance fired Bananas so that he ceased to be a man, but was simply blind desire. He did not make love to her gently or gaily, but with a black and savage ferocity. Her contempt now was changed to hatred, and when he besought her, she answered him with bitter, angry tones. But the struggle went on silently, and when the captain asked her after a little while whether Bananas was bothering her, she lied. But one night, when they were in Honolulu, he came on board only just in time. They were sailing at dawn. Banana had been ashore, drinking some native spirit, and he was drunk. The captain, rowing up, heard sounds that surprised him. He scrambled up the ladder. He saw Bananas, beside himself, trying to wrench open the cabin door. He was shouting at the girl. He swore he would kill her if she did not let him in. "What in hell are you up to?" cried Butler. The maid let go the handle, gave the captain a look of savage hate, and without a word turned away. "Stop here. What are you doing with that door?" The maid still did not answer. He looked at him with sullen, bootless rage. "I'll teach you not to pull any of your queer stuff with me, you dirty cross-eyed nigger," said the captain. He was a good foot shorter than the maid and no match for him, but he was used to dealing with native crews, and he had his knuckle duster handy. Perhaps it was not an instrument that a gentleman would use, but then Captain Butler was not a gentleman, nor was he in the habit of dealing with gentlemen. Before Bananas knew what the captain was at, his right arm had shot out and his fist, with its ring of steel, caught him fair and square on the jaw. He fell like a bull under the pole axe. "They'll learn him," said the captain. Banana did not stir. The girl unlocked the cabin door and came out. "Is he dead?" "He ain't." He called a couple of men and told them to carry the maid to his bunk. He rubbed his hands with satisfaction and his round blue eyes gleamed behind his spectacles. But the girl was strangely silent. She put her arms round him as though to protect him from invisible harm. It was 2 or 3 days before Bananas was on his feet again, and when he came out of his cabin his face was torn and swollen. Through the darkness of his skin you saw the livid bruise. Butler saw him slinking along the deck and caught him. The mate went to him without a word. "See here, Bananas," he said to him, fixing his spectacles on his slippery nose, for it was very hot. "I ain't going to fire you for this, but you know now that when I hit hard. Don't forget it, and don't let me have any more funny business." Then he held out his hand and gave the mate that good-humoured, flashing smile of his, which was his greatest charm. The mate took the outstretched hand and twitched his swollen lips into a devilish grin. The incident in the captain's mind was so completely finished that when the three of them sat at dinner he chaffed Bananas on his appearance. He was eating with difficulty, and his swollen face still more distorted by pain. He looked truly a repulsive object. That evening, when he was sitting on the upper deck smoking his pipe, a shiver passed through the captain. "I don't know that I should be shivering for on a night like this," he grumbled. "Maybe I've gotten a dose of fever. I've been feeling a bit queer all day." When he went to bed he took some quinine, and next morning he felt better, but a little washed out, as though he were recovering from a debauch. "I guess my liver's out of order," he said, and he took a pill. He had not much appetite that day, and towards evening he began to feel very unwell. He tried the next remedy he knew, which was to drink 2 or 3 hot whiskies, but that did not seem to help him much, and when in the morning he surveyed himself in the glass he thought he was not looking quite the thing. "If I ain't right by the time we get back to Honolulu I'll just give Dr. Denby a call. He'll sure fix me up." He could not eat. He felt a great lassitude in all his limbs. He slept soundly enough, but he awoke with no sense of refreshment. On the contrary, he felt a peculiar exhaustion. And the energetic little man, who could not bear the thought of lying in bed, had to make an effort to force himself out of his bunk. After a few days he found it impossible to resist the languor that oppressed him, and he made up his mind not to get up. "Bananas can look after the ship," he said. "He has before now." He laughed a little to himself as he thought how often he had lain speechless in his bunk after a night with the boys. That was before he had his girl. He smiled at her and pressed her hand. She was puzzled and anxious. He saw that she was concerned about him and tried to reassure her. He had never had a day's illness in his life, and in a week at the outside it would be as right as rain. "I wish you'd fired Bananas," she said. "I've got a feeling that he's at the bottom of this." "Damned good thing I didn't, or there'd be no one to sail the ship. I know a good sailor when I see one." His blue eyes, rather pale now, with the whites all yellow, twinkled. "You don't think he's trying to poison me, little girl?" She did not answer, but she had 1 or 2 talks with the Chinese cook, and she took great care with the captain's food. But he ate little enough now, and it was only with the greatest difficulty that she persuaded him to drink a cup of soup 2 or 3 times a day. It was clear that he was very ill. He was losing weight quickly, and his chubby face was pale and drawn. He suffered no pain, but merely grew every day weaker and more languid. He was wasting away. The round trip on this occasion lasted about 4 weeks, and by the time they came to Honolulu, the captain was a little anxious about himself. He had not been out of his bed for more than a fortnight, and really he felt too weak to get up and go to the doctor. He sent a message asking him to come on board. The doctor examined him, but could find nothing to account for his condition. His temperature was normal. "See here, Captain," he said, "I'll be perfectly frank with you. I don't know what's the matter with you, and just seeing you like this don't give me a chance. You come into the hospital so that we can keep you under observation. There's nothing organically wrong with you, I know that, and my impression is that a few weeks in hospital ought to put you to rights. I ain't going to leave my ship. Chinese owners were queer customers, he said. If he left his ship because he was sick, his owner might fire him, and he couldn't afford to lose his job. So long as he stayed where he was, his contract safeguarded him, and he had a first-rate mate. Besides, he couldn't leave his girl. No man could want a better nurse. If anyone could pull him through, she would. Every man had to die once, and he only wished to be left in peace. He would not listen to the doctor's expostulations, and finally the doctor gave in. "I'll write you a prescription," he said doubtfully, "and see if it does you any good. You'd better stay in bed for a while." "There ain't much fear of my getting out dark," answered the captain. "I feel as weak as a cat." But he believed in the doctor's prescription as little as did the doctor himself, and when he was alone, amused himself by lighting his cigar with it. He had to get amusement out of something, for his cigar tasted like nothing on earth, and he smoked only to persuade himself that he was not too ill to. That evening, a couple of friends of his, masters of tram steamers, hearing he was sick, came to see him. They discussed his case over a bottle of whisky and a box of Philippine cigars. One of them remembered how a mate of his had been taken queer just like that, and not a doctor in the United States had been able to cure him. He had seen in the paper an advertisement of a patent medicine and thought there'd be no harm in trying it. The man was as strong as ever he'd been in his life after 2 bottles, but his illness had given Captain Butler a lucidity which was new and strange. And while they talked, it seemed to read their minds. They thought he was dying. And when they left him, he was afraid. The girl saw his weakness. This was her opportunity. She had been urging him to let a native doctor see him, and he had stoutly refused. But now she entreated him. He listened with harassed eyes. He wavered. It was very funny that the American doctor could not tell what was the matter with him, but he did not want her to think that he was scared. If he let a damn nigger come along and look at him, it was to comfort her. He told her to do what she liked. The native doctor came the next night. The captain was lying alone, half awake, and the cabin was dimly lit by an oil lamp. The door was softly opened, and the girl came in on tiptoe. She held the door open, and someone slipped in silently behind her. The captain smiled at this mystery, but he was so weak now, the smile was no more than a glimmer in his eyes. The doctor was a little old man, very thin and very wrinkled, with a completely bald head and the face of a monkey. He was bowed and gnarled like an old tree. He looked hardly human, but his eyes were very bright, and in the half-darkness they seemed to glow with a reddish light. He was dressed filthily in a pair of ragged dungarees, and the upper part of his body was naked. He sat down on his haunches and for 10 minutes looked at the captain. Then he felt the palms of his hands and the soles of his feet. The girl watched him with frightened eyes. No word was spoken. Then he asked for something that the captain had worn. The girl gave him the old felt hat, which the captain used constantly, and taking it, he sat down again on the floor, clasping it firmly with both hands, and rocking backwards and forwards slowly. He muttered some gibberish in a very low tone. At last he gave a little sigh and dropped the hat. He took an old pipe out of his trouser pocket and lit it. The girl went over to him and sat by his side. He whispered something to her, and she started violently. For a few minutes they talked in hurried undertones, and then they stood up. She gave him money and opened the door for him. He slid out as silently as he had come in. Then she went over to the captain and leaned over him so that she could speak into his ear. "Is an enemy praying you to death?" "Don't talk fool stuff, girlie," he said impatiently. "It's truth. It's God's truth. That's why the American doctor couldn't do anything. Our people can do that. I've seen it done. I thought you were safe because you were a white man. I haven't an enemy. Bananas. What's he want to pray me to death for? You ought to have fired him before he had a chance. I guess if I ain't got nothing more the matter with me, then Bananas hoodoo I shall be sitting up and taking nourishment in a very few days." She was silent for a while, and she looked at him intently. "Don't you know you're dying?" she said to him at last. That was what the 2 skippers had thought, but they hadn't said it. A shiver passed across the captain's wan face. "The doctor says there ain't nothing really the matter with me. I've only to lie quiet for a bit and I shall be all right." She put her lips to his ear as if she were afraid that the air itself might hear. "You're dying, dying, dying. You'll pass out with the old moon." "That's something to know." "You'll pass out with the old moon unless Bananas dies before." She was not a timid man, and he had recovered already from the shock her words, and still more her vehement, silent manner, had given him. Once more a smile flickered in his eyes. "I guess I'll take my chance, girlie." "That's 12 days before the new moon." There was something in her tone that gave him an idea. See here, my girl, this is all bunk. I don't believe a word of it. But I don't want you to try any of your monkey tricks with Bananas. He ain't a beauty, but he's a first-rate mate." He would have said a good deal more, but he was tired out. He suddenly felt very weak and faint. It was always at that hour that he felt worse. He closed his eyes. The girl watched him for a minute and then slipped out of the cabin. The moon, nearly full, made a silver pathway over the dark sea. It shone from an unclouded sky. She looked at it with terror, for she knew that with his death the man she loved would die. His life was in her hands. She could save him. She alone could save him. But the enemy was cunning, and she must be cunning too. She felt that someone was looking at her, and without turning, by a sudden fear that seized her, knew that from the shadow the burning eyes of the mate were fixed upon her. She did not know what he could do. If he could read her thoughts, she was defeated already, and with a desperate effort she emptied her mind of all content. His death alone could save her lover, and she could bring his death about. She knew that if he could be brought to look into a calabash in which was water, so that the reflection of him was made, and the reflection were broken by hurtling the water, he would die as though he had been struck by lightning, for the reflection was his soul. But none knew better than he the danger, and he could be made to look only by a guile which had lured his least suspicion. He must never think that he had an enemy who was on the watch to cause his destruction. She knew what she had to do, but the time was short. The time was terribly short. Presently she realized that the mate had gone. She breathed more freely. 2 days later they sailed, and there were 10 now before the new moon. Captain Butler was terrible to see. He was nothing but skin and bone, and he could not move without help. He could hardly speak. But she dared do nothing yet. She knew that she must be patient. The mate was cunning. They went to one of the smaller islands of the group and discharged cargo. And now there were only 7 days more. The moment had come to start. She brought some things out of the cabin she shared with the captain and made them into a bundle. She put the bundle in the deck cabin where she and Bananas ate their meals, and at dinner time, when she went in, he turned quickly, and she saw that he had been looking at it. Neither of them spoke, but she knew what he suspected. She was making her preparations to leave the ship. He looked at her mockingly. Gradually, as though to prevent the captain from knowing what she was about, she brought everything she owned into the cabin, and some of the captain's clothes, and made them all into bundles. At last Bananas could keep silence no longer. He pointed to a suit of ducks. "What are you going to do with that?" he asked. She shrugged her shoulders. "I'm going back to my island." He gave a laugh that distorted his grim face. The captain was dying, and she meant to get away with all she could lay hands on. "What you do if I say you can't take those things? They're the captain's." "They're no use to you," she said. There was a calabash hanging on the wall. It was the very calabash I had seen when I came into the cabin and which we had talked about. She took it down. It was all dusty, so she poured water into it from the water bottle and rinsed it with her fingers. "What are you going to do with that?" "I can sell it for $50, she said. "If you want to take it, you'll have to pay me." "What do you want?" "You know what I want." She allowed a fleeting smile to play on her lips. She flashed a quick look at him and quickly turned away. He gave a gasp of desire. She raised her shoulders a little shrug. With a savage bound he sprang upon her and seized her in his arms. Then she laughed. She put her arms, her soft, round arms, about his neck and surrendered herself to him voluptuously. When the morning came, she roused him out of a deep sleep. The early rays of the sun slanted into the cabin. He pressed her to his heart. Then he told her that the captain could not last more than a day or 2, and the owner wouldn't so easily find another white man to command the ship. If Bananas offered to take less money, he would get the job and the girl could stay with him. He looked at her with lovesick eyes. She nestled up against him. She kissed his lips, in the foreign way, in the way the captain had taught her to kiss. and she promised to stay. Bananas was drunk with happiness. It was now or never. She got up and went to the table to arrange her hair. There was no mirror, and she looked into the calabash, seeking for her reflection. She tidied her beautiful hair. Then she beckoned to Bananas to come to her. She pointed to the calabash. "There's something in the bottom of it," she said. Instinctively, without suspecting anything, Bananas looked full into the water. His face was reflected in it. In a flash she beat upon it violently with both her hands so that they pounded on the bottom and the water splashed up. The reflection was broken in pieces. Bananas started back with a sudden hoarse cry and he looked at the girl. She was standing there with a look of triumphant hatred on her face. A horror came into his eyes. His heavy features were twisted in agony, and with a thud, as though he had taken a violent poison, he crumpled up onto the ground. A great shudder passed through his body, and he was still. She leaned over him callously. She put her hand on his heart, and then she pulled down his lower eyelid. He was quite dead. She went into the cabin in which lay Captain Butler. There was a faint colour in his cheeks, and he looked at her in a startled way. "What's happened?" he whispered. They were the first words he had spoken for 48 hours. "Nothing's happened," she said. "I feel all funny." Then his eyes closed and he fell asleep. He slept for a day and a night, and when he awoke he asked for food. In a fortnight he was well. It was past midnight when Winter and I rowed back to shore, and we had drunk innumerable whiskies and sodas. "What do you think of it all?" asked Winter. "What a question! If you mean, have I any explanation to suggest, I haven't. The captain believes every word of it." "That's obvious, but you know that's not the part that interests me most, whether it's true or not, and what it all means. The part that interests me is that such things should happen to such people. I wonder what there is in that commonplace little man to arouse such a passion in the lovely creature. As I watched her asleep there while he was telling the story, I had some fantastic idea about the power of love being able to work miracles." "But that's not the girl," said Winter. "What on earth do you mean? Didn't you notice the cook?" "Of course I did. He's the ugliest man I ever saw." "That's why Butler took him. The girl ran away with the Chinese cook last year. This is a new one. He's only had her there about 2 months." "Well, I'm hanged." "He thinks this cook is safe, but I wouldn't be too sure in his place. There's something about a Chink. When he lays himself out to please a woman, she can't resist him." Section 9.